Okay, am I audible?
Yeah.
You're audible.
Okay, perfect. I am going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think that any achievements we get when we prioritize the policy issues leads to far greater, more impactful, and more important changes. And so even if, which I don't think they're going to do, but even if opening opposition in general managed to prove that we very rarely actually manage to achieve anything, we think that almost any achievements will significantly outweigh the minor achievements that they might get on their side of the house. I'm going to explain why the kinds of things we achieve are very important. I'm going to explain why they are likely and thus they happen, and we're going to win the debate through that. If I have time, I'll also just talk about why holistically we need to invest a lot less in these kinds of in the kind of activities that oppositions are defending, and thus we should just heavily prioritize, just because it demands a lot more resources to get anything out of policy prioritization. Great. Before that, just to make this debate clean, what are we talking about when we say allocate, like focus? We're talking about allocating our resources, whether this is focusing our protest powers so that we mobilize people to go out and protest about policy-related issues, whether this is them calling their representatives, whether this is calling people to vote on it, whether this is investing funding in adverts and lobbyists and things like that, as opposed to what they would do on their side, I guess, would be funding people to go in and write Facebook things about canceling people, calling in general for people to be cancelled, doing, I don't know, the kinds of activities that would cost money and resources and political power and capacity from their side. Great. Why do we think that our factors are going to be more important? One, we can achieve sociocultural changes on our side of the house. Why is that the case? I think that the things that create the largest structural barriers to people being able to access things like fair media representation, to people being able to access to be able to have the power to cancel public individuals themselves, or to even not need to cancel public individuals, people will not treat them badly, is the structural oppression that they face through things like, for example, poverty or jail, where those things prevent you from being able to access good jobs, like becoming a lawyer, like becoming a police member, because you can't afford a degree or because your criminal record itself means that you cannot access these kinds of jobs. And this is what prevents you from being able to then become, for example, a reporter because you don't have a degree in English writing, or you didn't have access to a good school because you live in a poor neighborhood. And this means that you cannot actually ever get to these positions. On the comparative sociocultural, like focusing on sociocultural policies doesn't actually achieve policy change. Why? Because oftentimes when people get rich, they stop caring about poor people. So even if we focus on making certain members be able to actually access this, we have no certainty, and oftentimes they will actively not do things that are in our favor. This looks like when people do actually manage to break the glass ceiling, they still prevent other people from actually being able to move forward, or they stop being in favor of significant reallocation of resources because all of a sudden they're rich and the money is going to be taken away from them. Secondly, the scale of impact. Just like think about Maslow's needs, or how deeply you're affected when you don't have food security. And so when you wake up in the morning, you don't know if your children are going to go hungry. When you don't have a steady job, and that means if you break your leg or something like that and can't work for 3 weeks, you're going to be below the poverty line and have to take out a loan, which may actually mean that you will never be able to pay back, and you will constantly be fighting in order to keep your head above water. I think that just on the scale of how much this bothers you, on the scale of your daily dealing with these kinds of things, both in a negative manner, meaning how bad it is, and in a positive manner, meaning when you don't have these feelings, how good it feels to be full, then you have far more benefit than if you, I don't know, don't see a black person on TV who looks like you and you can relate to and you can feel like is a significant role model. Obviously, having a role model is important. But since we're talking about a trade-off between the two, it is clear that one is more important than the other. Cool. Third, certainty. I just think we have much more insight and knowledge about exactly how good policies are going to be. We can actually check and research and verify that when we make certain kinds of investments, when we make certain kinds of policies, they will actually help a lot of people. And we can quantify exactly how many people will be saved from poverty, exactly how many people will not go to jail, exactly how many people will recover from diseases that they otherwise would not recover from. On the other side, if we do things like, I don't know, what's the other example I've given in the motion? Oh yes, canceling public individuals, we have very little certainty that it will work. We tried canceling J.K. Rowling and it didn't work. Sometimes it works. I don't know, Harvey Weinstein, I guess, worked, but other times it doesn't. And we actually have very little certainty and very little ability to verify that the kinds of policies or things that we do on opposition side will actually end up with anything either in the long term or in the short term, and thus we should prioritize things where we have much greater certainty. Now, why are we actually going to get all these great things? Before that, I guess let's talk about a POI from CO.
The extent of your argumentation so far is it is important to help poor people. You also have to prove that progressive policy is good for poor people. Can you prove this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when you talk about things like economic redistribution or, reforming the criminal justice system, it's pretty clear that if you get rid of things like the three-strike policy, and so people don't get sent to jail just because they had drugs, which disproportionately affects Black minorities, or you make sure that Black ghettos get more investment if you live in the States, or you make it easier for them to access healthcare because that's the kind of things that you do, or you vote in favor of UBI or raising minimum wage so that they have more funding in order to be able to both buy food, but also to have more security in their lives, I think those things are probably going to be helpful. Great. Why do we actually get these things that we think are helpful? One, coalition building. I think that the policies that we're talking about are often of interest to many different groups, right? They're not just of interest to progressive, they're also of interest to, for example, labor unions, all of whom will benefit from a raised minimum wage. They're often the things that Democrats in general support because they align with Democrat philosophy in ways, political philosophy, in ways that things like canceling people doesn't. Also, things like canceling people can actually come at the expense of an individual rather than at the level of a policy, which means that people are often afraid they're going to be personally attacked around these kinds of things, or they often associate very negative connotations rather than positive building suggestions from the progressives, which mean they don't want to work with them on opposition's side of the house. Second, finally, I think you also just have poor communities who aren't systematically oppressed, who will benefit from these things, and so are likely to vote for you who are likely to vote for you. Secondly, you also just have political individuals who you can recruit and be pretty sure will represent you well. You have people like lobbyists who you might be able to pay, but you also have people like politicians who will be dependent on your donations and votes and are going to be far more beholden to you than some random people who you either are scared that you might or might not randomly cancel them or might not help them get into, help be really successful actors. Secondly, we think we get more support on our side of the house. One, because we go after things that are far more urgent policies that will in fact impact people's lives, and so people can relate to them a lot more and care about them a lot more. Secondly, we seem a lot less whiny. Like, I'm sorry, but most people, when they hear about progressives being like, we're going to cancel this person because they were so bad, 80% of the time say, these guys are idiots. Who gives a shit? Why are they worrying about that when we have the economy to care about? And this means that you just lose a lot of credibility. Thirdly, it plays into the narrative that the average voter relates to about big business taking over and how much we dislike big business and we need to take down big business, rather than going for specific attacks against people, which is oftentimes you. Finally, I think that a lot more people are going to be mobilized because you're talking about more compelling problems that people can understand better with a clear benefit to their lives. Please propose.
I thank that speaker for that fine speech. Now I would like to call upon the leader of the opposition to open up the case.
Hi. Just checking. Am I audible and visible? Fantastic. I'm going to try not to swear for the first time in one of my speeches for a while, because I'm pretty sure my mother's going to want to watch this at some point, so I need to set a good example. Note about POIs exclusively in the chats. If you unmute yourself when I have asked you not to, I will be unhappy. I won't swear at you because that's bad, isn't it, Mother? Anyway, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The case from opening opposition is going to be very simple. Everything opening government wants to achieve, we necessarily get the ability to achieve in a better way, purely because the ways in which they get shut down specifically on their side is because of the significant amount of media control and the disproportionate power structures that necessarily exist. These are the things that the policies that we want to pursue. Fundamentally, 2 claims. 1, the characterization of the media, why it is always going to be put in a system in which it goes against you. 2, the impact of that, which is specifically about the way in which it affects the buy-in of various different groups, specifically 3 groups. 1, the general public as a whole. 2, politicians as a whole. 3, minority groups as a whole. Responses to opening government are going to be integrated throughout my case. All right, then. The media landscape. Why is it always going to be disadvantageous? Because no, a vast majority of media companies and media outlets are specifically going to be controlled by people with right-wing agendas in mind. Why is this specifically going to be the case? A, these people are likely going to be rich, which means the interests they necessarily have are going to be ones to try and preserve the significant amount of wealth that they necessarily have. That is to say, right-wing media biases, and specifically right-wing narratives as a whole, specifically go against the idea of any form of progressive ideology. That is to say, progressive ideology is always advocating for some form of state intervention to necessarily happen. right-wing ideologies is always calling for a lack of state intervention in many of these situations, right? Which means that every single type of policy that you try to put forward, whether that be from climate change to criminal justice to like a wealth redistribution, this in some way clashes against a right-wing ideology which has the ability to affect those media owners, which means that they go on to B, control the way in which those narratives are necessarily perpetrated throughout society. Even the ones who tend to be more left-wing still do not agree to every single ideology that more progressive groups are necessarily calling for, which means they still don't present you in the best light possible, right? Which means that when the vast majority of people are confronted with this, and also because they have more media resources generally anyway, they have more of an ability to get these messages and narratives out to vast more people, right? They have the ability to get the advertising out there. They have the ability to have more channels out there, which means they have generally more people reading and consuming the news, which means they get more and more people consuming that narrative. So specifically then, why it means that as the progressive movements need to address that specific balance. And that's why focusing more on the idea of representation of your groups, as well as taking out the more toxic elements. Because no, I think some of the worst media personalities as well necessarily perpetrate the most harmful narratives, both against like general policies that we necessarily want to happen in the first place, but also generally against like the movement as a whole, right? The fact that they're more willing to use crass flanderization of these groups in the first place and necessarily portray them as significantly worse than they ever are going to be in the first place, but also just in some situations just lie, and they have the ability to reach people with these lies, right? Look at people like, say, Joe Rogan. If Joe Rogan goes out in the media and necessarily says that the ways in which certain policies try to address certain issues is generally a bad thing, this gets consumed a lot more, and this gets spread out to a lot more people, right? Even more moderates over time necessarily have some degree of tinge, because the narrative is always going to be, these policies are necessarily going to be affecting you. And because of the fact that there's often going to be a disbalance specifically in the representation, that narrative is always going to win out. So fundamentally, the impacts of this, all of opening government is contingent on buy-in of the overall populace, right? And that happens in a couple of ways. One, the general public. You need them to be in support of your policy specifically, which means that the information that you need them to get in order to want to support these policies in the first place has to be that of a positive slant, right? The problem is, like I said, the media that they're just digesting doesn't give that. They say that people have a narrative that necessarily want to combat big business, right? The problem is that big business often tends to be the media themselves, right? They don't necessarily allow you to foster that development into something that's actually going to be quite useful, right? And even the more progressive movements don't have a full ability to mobilize a significant amount of people in order to be able to do this, right? Because because at most you get the people who would already support you in the first place, right? But the moderates still don't have enough of a leeway for this to necessarily happen. At the point in which one of the things you necessarily campaign on is trying to deal with a significant amount of representation, you have the ability for you to be able to get out that, to get like some form of positive media out on your side. But also no, and so far as cancelling, who are the individuals who try to cancel, right? They tend to be the ones who generally propagate the worst sorts of views against people in the first place, right? Opening government says that cancelling doesn't always work, right? I agree with you, cancelling is not always 100%, right? But the thing is, we still get significant leverage at the point where you would remove them even from some platforms, right? Even getting them off of some platforms means you get some ability to balance the discourse. So you at least get more people to see your version of events, which means you get more people to care about these issues. This is important for group B, the politicians, because those are the people who fundamentally put forward the policy changes and advocate for the things you necessarily need to change in the first place. They don't do that at the point in which there is no significant public will for all of the reasons I've told you. Before that, CG, do you have a point? Okay, OG.
Yeah, if CNBC, The Guardian, and New York Times are so right-wing, I'm not sure how Craig is actually going to achieve your change in the first place.
So like I said, this is about the idea of like balance of representation, right? Because realistically, if the thing you're trying to campaign for is just allowing for representation to exist in the first place, right? Because I'm not saying it's a 100% right-wing bias. I'm just saying that like the overall tilt is in that favor, right? But you significantly skew that balance back in our favor when you take out the most harmful toxic elements, right? And realistically, like if you try and get people cancelled on issues which are like genuinely quite significant, I think you end up then having the media reaction being you need to replace these people specifically with ones who necessarily veer away from that toxic element, right? Which is why they do have incentives then to replace them with more moderate elements, which means you get more of that ability for that discourse to come through in the first place, right? So that's why then you necessarily get the politicians to at least least have some more leeway. Finally, then, specifically about minorities, because I think these groups of people are the ones who often become your most active base for any form of political engagement as well. They necessarily want the ability for their representation to be felt, and you need to be able to solve these things on a structural reason. But they need the ability for those issues to be heard in the first place, right? So why is it that if we don't focus on the socio-cultural issues, they become disinterested? Two things. One, at the point where they don't think that the governments are necessarily ever going to listen to what it is that their concerns necessarily are, you disengage them specifically from actually listening to any state messaging in the first place, right? This is harmful insofar as, say, having to get them to listen to certain policies in certain situations. Secondly, you also just need some form of empathy gap to be able to care about the larger issues in the first place, right? Look, Hamza will expand on this, but generally, I think at the point in which you want people to care about the messages you're saying, you need to change how that message is told. We beg you to oppose.
Great, I thank that speaker for that fine speech, and I'll call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for side government. Hear, hear.
Hey, assuming I am audible.
Yep.
Excellent. That's nice to hear. Great. I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are two important clashes in this debate, as there are in nearly every social movement debate. The first is what is more important to fight for, and the second is what are we more likely to achieve. We think that we win on both of these clashes, but also that very clearly the importance of what we're fighting for is also the more important clash within the debate, because it's what determines whether our achievements are even worth having to begin with and worth dedicating any resources to. Some rebuttal to OO. I am then going to go into the clashes, weigh one against the other, and explain why we win on both. But first, responses. And to this claim that, oh, well, the media is always against you, so we need to be focusing on it to flip it to our side. And with then, as Yishai points out in POI, very little explanation why we're likely to be able to actually signals of these media companies and the priorities and desires that they represent and the policies that they are interested in. No matter how much you do, they're never going to give you victories that are their shareholders and political interests of the people that are advertising on their platforms. So the point is that I don't know why you actually achieve anything of any significance. We think that the likely scenario is at best, you get some sort of symbolic victories. They give you a bone of, oh, well, look, we gave you the thing, you can see them here, but they don't change any of the actual messaging or the things that they are campaigning for or against. And when policy demands are made, and it seems that OO agree with us that that is the end goal and the important thing, which is changing policy, then they still act against those and speak out against those, because those are things that they're not willing to concede on within these media contexts, and so will not help us. So the narratives remain the same. Next, we're told that, oh, they have more media resources, they have own these companies, so they determine public opinion entirely, and there's nothing we can do if we don't have access to them. Just simply very untrue. First off, there is obviously alternative media, which is a growing and far more important aspect of how people form their opinions in the modern world. These things often have nothing to do with advertising money or your ability to access television or things like that, but just your ability to post and create interest online and to have people bother to engage with what you are saying and then make sure it propagates and more people see and hear from it. Second, you have physical mobilization. These are things like protests and being out on the street and showing that people care about these issues and making others more aware of their existence. This is things like salons and door-to-door campaigning and speaking to people and getting the word out. None of these are dependent on these conglomerates. And lastly, we have individual lobbying, which means you don't even have to be going through the media directly. You can be speaking to policymakers and explaining to them why frequently these policies, even if there isn't a public push to do them, are to the benefit of the policymaker, because the results will be ones that they can take credit for, even if there isn't currently some sort of movement or media demand for them. Policymakers often will suggest policies that the general public isn't even thinking about or aware of, but they still will be happening and no one has to actually be talking about it. And this is the next thing, where they try to push on us the burden that we are contingent on buying from the general public. Simply not true, both because of this Frequently, policies are determined not by how much the public buy-in, but by the strength of preference of certain individuals within society and a proportion of society. When for a group, this is so crucial that they will always vote based on this issue. Even if they're not the majority, you need to cater to them, because otherwise you will lose them entirely as voters, and catering to them doesn't lose other voters, because for other voters, this issue isn't as important and they're not going to change their opinion based on that. There's also, as we said, issues of things like boots on the ground, creating pressure through protests, or initial contact and immediate contact through lobbying. All of these things are direct things that aren't dependent on there being huge public support, but some level of public interest, which can be a lot lower, but one that is expressed as being an enormous preference. This strength of preference is only unlocked when we're talking about issues that are genuinely very, very important to the people we're trying to represent and help, and therefore they show that strength of preference, and policymakers are aware of them, and that is when we achieve change. Next on this thing of, well, what we get, because when we cancel people, we get rid of the absolute worst people that express their ideas as also. Well, I don't think that this matters to any extent, because the absolute worst people who are saying these awful things to begin with are only appealing to the very far right or conservatives, or the people who are willing to at any extent buy into what these people are saying. We don't think that either side of the debate is going to win those people over or change their opinions about whether these policies ought to be implemented, because we don't think getting rid of the worst people speaking will then make them left-wing. They will still be against helping most of these groups, even if to a slightly less extreme degree. We don't think that makes any difference to the reality of most individuals. So we don't think that you get any more buy-in to the progressive side. And insofar as we get a bit more representation, there is no analysis why some extent of representation and symbolic letting people appear on your platform or being allowed to speak leads to actually convincing the general public that they should change their political opinions and flip sides, convincing policymakers that they should change their opinions, and not only convincing, but then also causing changes in policy. Note, this is a narrative case which has so many stages of burdens, from what this looks like to who the audience is seeing it, to why they are convinced by this message, to why they're convinced enough to go do something about it, and then why they have the power to, when they go do something about change reality. We don't think any of these burdens were met by opening opposition, but even if some are, not all of them, they do not have any impact within the debate. Before I continue, can I take closing? Opening.
So in the status quo, you have barriers that are fractured, let's say the environmental movement with climate change, and then like slavery reparations as well. But at least like on our side, you at least have only one person, one power group to target.
Okay, but first off, what you're doing by one person is just not changing anything and not speaking about any important issue. Next, when you say movements that are fractured, you just have different movements campaigning for different things. Yes, there are lots of different parts of society. They can all act in different interests. That doesn't mean that none of them achieve anything. And lastly, Yishai himself analyzed why, when we are focusing on policy, we're a lot more likely to be universal and appealing to larger groups of people and their interests, because things like climate change are in the interest of nearly everybody involved. Whereas representation of a Latina woman on a newscast just isn't of interest to the vast majority of individuals. So we actually get more cooperation and coalition and buy-in and concerted effort when you can also over time say, right now we're focusing on this issue, next time we'll focus on this issue, and so we're far more likely to achieve things. Why do we have the more important thing? We affect more people, as I just explained, to a far greater extent, because this isn't just a slight increase in perception, but an actual change in policy reality on more important issues of food income and security. Each victory is several-fold more impactful. And even if we win on every issue of representation and media and cancellation, we were likely doing less than one piece of legislation that would be achieved by focusing on policy. But we also think that the ease of concession for these sorts of media things means you get these symbolic victories and you just lose momentum for the movement, and likely alternative avenues and not doing anything would still get these symbolic victories just over time from public desire to see people, and it doesn't matter anyway. What matters is making sure that we are taken seriously and we get our policy changes. Please.
Great, I thank that speaker for that speech, and now I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Perfect. With that said, POIs in the chat, I will begin my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We often talk about the importance of climate change and how it will kill everyone in Africa by the end of the century, and yet we avoid the microaggressions that are faced by African Americans on daily life that alienate them from actually engaging with policy-making decisions and social movements to begin with as well. The first clash that I will address is why does focusing on policy issues actually alienate the policy and divide them even further, which means that you fracture the support base that you have crucially, which is the premise of opening government's argument in a nutshell, that you need policymakers to actually listen to you. There are 4 broad reasons for this. The first one is that if you read like any academic literature, it points to the fact that people are usually loss aversive. The intuition that I would use here is that if you gave me £5 to win, but if I lose, then I will lose those £5, then I will probably opt not to gamble that money simply because I've earned those £5, even though here the ratio of me winning and losing is the exact same as well. This means that the right-wing media can now weaponize narratives that, you know what, for climate redistribution, for slavery reparation, these are the wealth objects that you have that people will now be taking away as well, which probably decreases the support that you can have. You give these right-wing groups more ammunition. But secondly, policy issues also require a lot of commitment as well, which essentially means that you have to like go and protest against these outside the Senate, or perhaps to like give a lot of like donations as well, so that they can be reached to like a specific group so that they can organize their protests as well. The issue here is that you risk facing the wrath of the system as well, which means that there are much more risks involved towards you personally. As a result of this, you probably don't want to engage with this to begin with. The third reason is that people don't like to back a losing horse as well. A lot of the times, issues with climate change or a lot of the social or a lot of the public policies are quite distant in the future. We can't solve climate change now. Climate change will probably be solved in 30 years from now, or like 40 years from now, which means that people can't rationalize or conceptualize how this contingency will be solved for them to begin with as well. What happens on the comparative is that people are losing their resources and putting them on the line, which is a narrative that the right-wing media can weaponize on, but they lose on that legitimacy, which means that people are much more likely to buy into that movement if they don't necessarily think that there are any personal risks associated with joining this. But secondly, people perceive this as much more proximate to be solved as well, as something that is happening in the moment. If I'm canceling a figure because they're like propagating more microaggressions against people, then this is something that can be solved now. This is something that I can see the results of now as well, as opposed to something that's going to happen like 30 years down the line as well. The way in here is simple. First of all, for you to have politicians to listen to you, politicians needs to see numbers to actually focus on you as well, insofar as the fact that politicians are rent seeking. When you have a broad support base because people are buying into the movement, that is when you actually actualize a lot of the OG's case. Secondly, people actually, there's like a there's an effect that once people see a lot of people joining this specific movement, more people join into this movement as well. This means that this gives people, the vulnerable actors in this debate who are facing the microaggressions, a community and catharsis or a coping mechanism in the short term to actually default to while long-term policy changes are happening to begin with. Because if you heavily prioritize this, if all of your lawyers are simply targeting like different climate change issues, etc., then you are necessarily taking the attention away from this. You're shifting the discussion away from the actual people that are on the ground as well. But third of all, microaggressions are much more proximate to people as well. They happen much more frequently as well, and they're like they have like a longevity of harm as well. Because if a microaggression has happened to me today, I will probably think about that like 5 days down the line. But if I know that person has been cancelled, that person has been like punished, then this will lower the chances of like alienating like the most crucial voting bloc, which is like the people from like different ethnic minority communities who are facing these like social cultural issues as well, who will probably like protest outside the government. And these are the people that you're fundamentally representing as a movement as well. The second clash is why are social cultural issues much more likely to be solved, and why do you have better media representation? The first argument is that you act as a deterrence once you're heavily involved in canceling people, because now these people see that their careers might be destroyed because all of your resources are heavily being prioritized onto them. But the second reason why is because now you're not necessarily stretching your ammunitions on like 5 different fronts. Essentially, like climate change is quite different than like slavery reparations, which is quite different than the criminal justice system. This literally means that you're stretching the lawyers that you have with the people that are engaging with different protests as well. As a result of this, you're probably able to like target all of your attention on one specific issue, which means that the likelihood for you to succeed is much higher as well. Even if the barriers that all of these movements have that are facing are essentially the same, at least now you're concentrating your effort on one. All of your lawyers are going to like one specific thing as well. The reason that media representation is so important is because all of the narratives about climate change, all of the narratives about slavery reparation are predicated upon the people speaking about them, such as like Joe Rogan, etc. The moment that you tell these people that you can be cancelled, this is when you affect the rational decision making of these people as well. But secondly, you see the media all the time as well. You don't necessarily engage with politicians on a daily basis. You don't see what happens with the climate change policy on a daily basis as well, which means that the media representation is much higher in priority. Before I move on, CG.
Are the social movements the only forces driving the progressive agenda in social media, like media in general?
They might not be the only one, but they are the ones that the most vulnerable actors in the group engage with and probably want to form a community in as well, because you risk alienating them. On to opening opposition's claims. The first one was that cancelling people is contradictory to like free speech. The first thing that I would like to note here is that progressive politics, like protecting minority rights, is already at the cost of free speech as well. I just don't necessarily understand why people care about free speech to such a large extent when people already see a lot of their autonomy, so that they don't necessarily have to be at the front of hate speech. But if this is even the case, then this gives you the political capital to actually create change as well, because this is something that is relatively less polarizing for the public to engage with as well, because topics such as like slavery reparation are again an assault on the things that you have like worked hard for, or that's the way that you will probably like spin it in your own head as well. Secondly, poor people will get donations from like rich people, but now they won't donate because they will think they get cancelled. The first thing that I would like to note here is that when people get cancelled, they don't just get cancelled because they've said like something random. People don't get cancelled left, right, center. It's usually when they've said something that is quite quite outrageous as well. Lastly, on the accessibility to progressive politics in life, which is that this is much more certain and knowledge is like quite easily collected. The first thing that I would like to note is how many people actually engage with academic or scientific findings for your own social movement, because this is an active motion. But secondly, how will this information will not be unchallenged when Craig gave you so many mechanisms about how you have to preserve your own wealth if you're in different power groups. But lastly, collecting information is not the same as distributing information or digesting information. Insofar as that is not possible, that is the only key contingency in opening government's case. For all of those reasons, vote for op.
Great, I thank that speaker for that speech and all speakers on the top half. I now call upon the member of government to open up the back half of this debate. Hear.
Thank you.
Yep, you're audible.
Thanks. Yeah, recording.
Call upon the member of opposition.
Okay, cool. I'll take POIs in chat. Also, just a brief caveat, since this is being recorded, this is a debate for sake of cool debate things. This is not my personal opinion. Just feel like that should be out there. Anyways, starting in 3, 2, 1. The Inflation Reduction Act gave $400 billion for the pursuit of solar power and wind energy in the United States. But the rollout of that has been stymied by progressive activists whose concern with inclusivity and equity has blocked the green revolution. Progressive land redistribution in Southeast Asia, Zimbabwe, and Botswana left thousands and even millions of people on the brink of starvation and far poorer than they previously were. This is not an actor motion, it's a normative motion. And the thesis of closing opposition is quite simple. Progressives get things wrong all the time, and progressive political movements have real power in the world all the time. Leftist governments in Lula's Brazil and Boric's Chile are case in point, but progressive movements have power in coalitions, in governments, in halls of real power and influence. And the thesis of closing opposition is that progressive policy reform backfires, that even in the very best case for government, where they get all of the policies they envision, the consequences are a disaster for the very vulnerable groups that they claim to help. Why is it that progressive movements, on a balance of probabilities, support harmful policy initiatives that backfire? 5 broad reasons, and I'll then analyze specific areas in which progressives care about changing policy and why those specific reforms are bad. There are 5 general reasons. The first is that progressive movements are prone to internal radicalization because the people who self-select into these movements often have strong leftist priors and are unwilling to consider a center-right or libertarian perspective. There is also a strong internal emphasis on ideological purity, which purges moderate voices from progressive circles, and often means that people end up in leftist echo chambers like r/late stage capitalism on Reddit. That means that these movements are often too willing to focus on leftist solutions, even when leftism does not hold a monopoly on truth. Secondly, leftism disavows technocratic experts who often champion data-driven approaches to solving complex policy issues, because those experts and technocrats are viewed as ivory tower and disregarded as privileged, which means effective policy approaches that often do not sound sexy but work are often disregarded. Thirdly, there is a strong opposition to capitalism that is baked into leftist ideology. There is often an outright refusal to negotiate or cooperate with center-right and right-wing voices, even when those voices have meaningfully good policy proposals, like cutting zoning reforms, which is probably the best way to reduce housing costs, despite leftists' opposition to it. And furthermore, there is an unusually strong belief in Marxist materialist understandings of conflict theory. That means that the left often mobilizes anger against capitalism and blames broad structures as the cause of problems, even when specific localized policies are the real issue. Furthermore, leftism often prioritizes within progressive circles an overarching emphasis on equity, even at the exclusion of helping everyone. For example, lowering tax rates may very well be good for improving the economic pie for everyone, but leftists' opposition to inequality often stymies economic growth, and that's why many environmentalists, for example, champion policies like degrowth, which often backfire, as I'll explain later. Fourthly, leftists have a structural obsession with short-termist policy agendas, because in many cases, progressive movements harness anger, and that anger requires an immediate response to be quenched, which often means that these movements support increased government spending, massively increasing expenditures on welfare programs, even without a legitimate concern for deficits. That's why many progressives support hooked-up monetary theories like MMT, even when that goes in violation of fiscal constraints. Fifth, and most importantly, progressives often favor a strong and heavily interventionist state. They're often very willing to give more power, influence, and fiscal authority to the government. That's harmful because states often corrupt that power. There are selfish incentives for elites to utilize money given to them by progressives for corrupt patronage networks. And the fastest path to democratic backsliding is a strong and powerful state, actively emboldened by progressives. That's why Venezuela is such a nightmare under status quo. All of this analysis proves generally that the very best case for government, and I mean very best, as in we get no change on our side, but policy change on their side of the house, is actively bad because the types of policies to support are on balance bad. Why is the comparative sort of policy you get on our side of the house much better? Because moderates are powerful in politics. They often comprise a majority of the voting bloc and are willing to listen to technocratic experts, like, for example, monetary authorities, with reasonably sensible ways to solve issues like inflation or address problems like crime. That means that the moderating incentives, absent progressive intervention into policy reform debates, results in general in reasonably fair policies which reflect the median voters' interests. I'll explain at the very bottom of this extension why it is that we minimize the harm progressives do, but let's explain in particular why these specific policy reforms Gov champions are harmful. Before that, I'll give OG a chance to engage.
Yeah, cherry-picked examples ignore the fact that even most progressives aren't zealots and need, crucially, they have to shift the Overton window in order to actually solve the structural oppression people are suffering from.
Yeah, so this is great. This will get right into it. The Overton window argument is also actually bad because it means that leftists are often too obsessed with being as radical as is possible because they believe that shifts people's moderate opinions even when policies are bad. 4 areas where progressives are harmful. First, on government spending. Progressives often demand increased government spending, but the problem is the benefits are relatively minimal because they get snagged in implementation in bureaucracies, and pork barrel politics and coalition horse trading limits the benefit to real people. But the costs are huge. When governments massively increase expenditures, it often crowds out private capital because governments must finance their deficits by borrowing. That also drives interest rates up when governments borrow lots of money from private financial institutions. That doesn't just hurt real people on the ground whose mortgage interest rates now go up. It also drives inflation by injecting lots of money unhealthily into the economy. It also increases the real risk of debt crises when countries like Pakistan, Greece, or Argentina, which pursue progressive policy reform, then face crippling recession in the future, wiping out any of Gov's benefits. Secondly, on redistribution. Under our side, to be clear, what we get is a reasonable level of redistribution, like Bolsa Familia in Brazil or SNAP welfare in the United States, because there's a bipartisan consensus that helping people is generally good. But progressives champion a rapid intensification of progressive taxation, which often increases tax evasion by increasing the incentive to shirk tax regimes, induces capital flight because there is a signaling effect that the government seeks to implement anti-capitalist agendas, and most importantly, reduces incentives to innovate because private investors are more hesitant to support investing into new startups when they fear that the profits will not be intense. And it also limits the personal incentive to engage in innovative behavior. That outweighs any potential benefits government might claim, because innovation saves lives literally, consider pharmaceuticals, and lifts all boats. Thirdly, on climate change, environmental actions often backfire. The obsession with ideological purity often means there is an excess focus on inclusivity, which blocks, for example, nuclear energy projects. It means that progressives oppose market-based solutions, even when capital ways. To be clear, on our side of the house, there are still strong incentives for environmental action, given that people are increasingly aware of climate change, consider the current ongoing heat wave. Finally, on the harm of bad social advocacy is less directly tangible to government policy, which makes people's lives better and at least keeps the status quo opposed.
To call upon the opposition.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, just give me 1 second. I want to first weigh our claims on progressive policy against opening opposition's claims about movement strategy. Our case is that the quality of policy is more important than buy-in to the progressive movement. And this is for 3 reasons. Reason 1, it is a stronger argument for the loss of support of progressives on other areas like social justice, where most teams agree progressives are correct. That is, progressives are much more likely to lose support if high unemployment or an economic recession is widely blamed on or attributed to progressives. They are much more likely to lose support on the agenda of pushing social justice. This is a much clearer pathway to the loss of support than things like media narratives, because maybe someone sees a media narrative and changes their mind about progressivism, but they are more likely to change their mind about progressivism if they literally lose their jobs. Second, because progressives often do win elections. Sure, they are less likely to win elections on their side of the house, but they empirically still continue to maintain substantial presences in parliaments, either as the opposition, and end up in power in a large number of instances. When they do win elections, passing bad policies has really damaging effects that go beyond the culture war claims of opening opposition if we successfully show you that they throw large numbers of people in poverty, for example. But third, because of morality, there is a special obligation to not cause harm, even if that advances you strategically as a movement to cause benefit in other areas. This is because it is immoral to instrumentalize people or use them as means to an end. If a progressive policy fucks someone's life over, that is an inherent harm, regardless of the effect this has on overall movement strategy. Now you might ask, Tejas, in OO's case, progressives succeed on our side, so don't progressives also get the economic policies you're criticizing on your side? No, because you get more buy-in in opposition's world, according to OO's arguments, by getting a more moderate coalition of people. So you get Dalit business owners and indigenous communities involved in the progressive movement, people like business owners who wouldn't support the types of progressive policy that you're likely to start advocating for on their world. So if opening opposition is right that progressives win, once they win, they moderate themselves and therefore become substantially worse. Finally, you might ask, if progressives are so bad, don't progressive movements exist on both sides, as Closing Government asks? This is true, but our point is progressive policy is bad. We do not give you reasons to think progressive actions on social change are bad. With this framing out of the way, I want to go over whether we actually prove our argument. What are Closing Government's challenges for why we do not prove our argument? First, they accuse us of cherry-picking particular policies. I don't see why this is a response. We named a bunch of policy areas where progressives are bad. We give you reasons why they are bad. They do not engage with them. That is enough for us to win, simply because our claim is not contingent on progressives being radical. Even if progressives are not radical or they are moderated by the political system, Ryan gives you a bunch of reasons and a bunch of cases where progressive policy is bad and those reasons stay. But let me actually address CG's claims. Their first claim is you work with academia on statistics, you research your policies carefully because otherwise you do not get support. We explain why progressive movements are uniquely unlikely to engage in rigorous research of policy issues, especially research that contradicts pre-existing ideological claims. The reason why is progressivism is driven by distrust of elites and conflict theory. And there are two structural reasons for this. One, because this is empirically the intellectual base that progressivism derives from. For example, progressive movements often arose inspired by the Marxist movements of the early 20th century that emphasized class struggle. That means technocratic experts with PhDs are inherently unrelatable to the broader progressive audience, meaning data and statistics often alienate the movement. But the people is anger, to find common things to be angry about, and therefore that results in radicalization combined with norms in progressive politics that say you are at fault if you don't support the policy that aligns with us. Their second claim is you have a parliamentary conversation. Doesn't a parliamentary conversation just moderate your politics? Look, even if you had a moderate policy, you wouldn't get right-wing politicians on board. Political polarization empirically is increasing across the world because political parties see themselves as fundamentally opposed to each other. So when progressives are in power, they rarely try to court the support of the right wing. They are more likely to exploit the fact that they are in power in order to pass policies. Critically, though, our case is not contingent on progressives being radical. Our claim is progressive policy is bad in and of itself, and we give you reasons why. Now I want to engage with GovBench's potential reasons why progressive policy might be good. Their first reason is people with disadvantage, listening to disprivileged people and what their needs are. I want to first point out that this does not depend on progressive politics. This is because low-income people are a meaningful voting bloc for other political coalitions as well. One, because they are more likely to be swing voters. Low-income people were often disaffected by the political system and therefore don't have loyalty to any particular political party. That's the structural reason why working class and blue-collar workers in the US, for example, often switch between the Democratic and the Republican Party. So catering to them happens either way. The question is how you cater to them. Their second claim is in OG, they give you some reasons why these policies are plausibly bad. For example, they name things like redistribution, they name things like criminal justice reform. This is where I want to go over specific policy issues and explain why progressives are systematically worse on those fronts. The first is they push excessive government spending. This is because progressives can be unreasonable here because any politician is short-termist and knows the implication of something like a debt crash doesn't affect them, except conservatives have an ideological dogma for deficit hawkishness. This is not true of progressives, meaning they engage in spending that eventually drives inflation or drives up interest rates. Second, aggressive redistribution is often bad because it reduces incentives to do things like engage in innovation or business creation when you worry the tax is too high. How does this weigh against the impacts of redistribution on things like poverty? One, innovation lifts every single boat, including people like middle-class people. Second, innovation has impacts that last unto the long-term future, unlike a welfare system that can be gutted the moment a new political party arises. The third thing we tell you is about climate change, where we say there are incentives to do things on climate change anyway, but progressive calls for action on climate change both backfire, and by slowing economic growth rates, we have fewer resources to address the problem of climate change. This outweighs miscellaneous claims on support like cancel culture, because the best parts of the progressive movement that engage in social justice lose support if there is job loss en masse, if economic growth slows down. This is the tipping point for the progressive movement to substantially lose its base and lose support. For these reasons, oppose.
Good. I think that's speaker for that speech. I think all speakers for what was a fine debate.